Hello, hello. Welcome to Stories Between the Lines, a podcast. Stories connect us as humans. Everything we see and feel has a story. Are they interesting stories? Well, that depends on how it is told. This is your host, Nandini. In today's episode, I bring to you the ritualistic stories about the art of connecting dots. It's known as Kolam in the Indian language Tamil. Now you may wonder, what's there to talk so much about Kolam? Or what's the story behind this old art form? Well, listen in. This episode will peel the layers of this art and uncover its deep significance. You'd be surprised at what you're going to find out. Kolam is an artful design that connects the dots with lines to create a beautiful geometric pattern. Each morning on the doorsteps of many Indian homes, especially in Tamil Nadu, a state in South India, women draw this traditional art with rice flour at the entrance of their homes. With the ground as a canvas, hands as the paintbrush, and rice flour as the paint, this ancient form of art is a visual treat. Kolam during my younger days was just another ritualistic tradition. This art at the entryway of homes was a symbol of wellness and considered auspicious. My mom described it as an invitation to Goddess Lakshmi into the house first thing in the morning. Amongst the Hindu gods and goddesses, Goddess Lakshmi is considered a symbol of prosperity, peace, and happiness, and of course wealth. Anything that emits good vibes is connected to Goddess Lakshmi. Growing up in India, I've watched women gracefully hold the container filled with the white rice flour in one hand, their body bent, and with nimble fingers pinch the rice flour between the fingers to magically weave geometric pattern. This is like yogic art, a Surya Namaskar, to honor Mother Earth first thing in the morning. It is December, which means cold, wintry weathers in many parts of the world. In South India, especially in the state of Tamil Nadu, this winter month is called Margazhi. This year, the first day of Margazhi month commenced on December 16th and will end on January 13th, 2022. Most of the year in this part of India is hot and humid. Should I say extremely hot and humid. But the weather this time of the year is pleasant. Soothing temperatures in 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a cool 26 degrees centigrade. Yes, this is winter in this part of the world. Until last year, yes, the year when the world went indoors, I never really thought much about this beautiful art form beyond the realm of connecting the dots to create a pattern, sort of like solving a puzzle. Then one day, in the midst of all the social distancing, I found myself mindlessly drawing a kolam on a piece of paper. It was so therapeutic. It did wonders to take my disturbed mind away from the relentless pandemic news shown on TV. Soon, I started drawing kolam on home decors, on coasters, wooden trays, gift bags, etc., and gave them as gifts during Dussehra and Diwali. This newfound interest seeded the theme for this episode of the Stories Between the Lines podcast. During my research on Kolam, I was simply amazed by the various dimensions of this ritual art form that goes beyond just connecting the dots. So I am super excited to present this episode in 2 segments. In the first segment of this podcast, I am delighted and honored to welcome Dr. Vijaya Nagarajan to this podcast about Kolam. Dr. Nagarajan is an associate professor of theology, religious studies, and the program of environmental studies at the University of San Francisco. Her debut book, Feeding 1,000 Souls is an exploration of the Kolam. This book is the first comprehensive book in English about Kolam that helps discover this art form for its historical, mathematical, social, and cultural context. Dr. Nagarajan has written this book from the heart, laced with personal details of her own family tradition on Kolam and how this art has been an integral part of her life right from childhood, which she spent in India, and then subsequently when she and her family immigrated to the United States. She has been a voice for so many women, especially women of Tamil origin, living in the traditional South Indian cities like Tanjavur, Madurai, Chidambaram, and other temple towns who create this art every morning, even to this day. Thank you so much, Dr. Nagarajan, for taking the time from your very busy schedule to talk about Kolam today. It is an honor to have you as a guest on this podcast.
Thank you for having me, Nandini. This is a joy to be with you.
The pleasure is all mine, Professor. As a child, this art was more of a ceremonial or cultural form of art, connecting the dots with squiggly lines and then drawing lines around the dots was like solving a puzzle. It was a routine to see my aunts, my mom, and women in general draw from simple to more elaborate ones on festival days. Every time I see an extravagant kolam, it means it's a special day. So when I first read the title of your book, Feeding 1,000 Souls, an exploration of kolam in the context of women, rituals, and the ecology in India, it kind of made me stop and think about the significance of kolam beyond the usual boundaries of culture and tradition. As a child, I would love to watch these little sparrows, these birds known as kuruvis in Tamil. As the day goes by, these birds would happily perch themselves on the kolam and kind of diligently nibble the rice flour that was used to draw the kolam that morning. And my mother once explained to me that the rice flour used for kolam is actually serves as food for these birds. I don't ever remember her mixing any color or anything, because rice is a safe and staple food for all living beings, I suppose. In your book, you talk about the debt humans owe to animals since we have taken away the land from them to build homes and create a living for ourselves. What was your thought process for the title of this book, and why did you pick kolam as a topic?
Those are two beautiful questions. And feeding 1,000 souls, it was something that Tamil women, whenever I would ask them what were some of the underlying reasons for making the kolam, many women would say to me, they would give me the standard reasons, to welcome Lakshmi into the household, to celebrate auspiciousness, all those things that you normally hear. And then they would kind of lower their voice to a whisper and they would say, but the real reason we do the kolam. And I would say, what is it? And they would say, to feed 1,000 souls. And so there was a way in which that theme kept coming up as a kind of underlying, in a way, not quite a secret, but a kind of deeper reason why the kolam is made. And so, and as I observed the kolam, over these 50 years, really since I was a child, I've noticed, especially in the 90s and 80s and 90s, that there has been a shift from using rice flour to stone powder because it's generally cheaper. And also all the colored powders to sort of imitate the rangoli of the North. And so part of the reason I chose this title was I wanted to have the sort of underlying kind of subtextual reason for doing the kolam and really privileging that to remind ourselves that one of the first ritual acts, and this is something that, you mentioned that making a kolam is like solving a puzzle, and that is true. And also even writing this book and talking to women, hundreds and hundreds of women throughout Tamil Nadu, over a period of 20 years, in villages and towns and cities throughout Tamil Nadu, and even traveling throughout India as well, and looking at other women's ritual art forms, it really struck me that this book is a kind of trying to figure out a puzzle for myself, that what does the kolam actually mean? Beyond its ritual and aesthetic significance. And so that was part of the reason why I titled it Feeding 1,000 Souls, because the more I listened to women, the more I paid attention to the kolam in its ritual context, I thought, oh, this is really a very profound, beautiful reason for why the kolam is made. And it took me many years to figure out the sort of underlying reason, that there was even Feeding 1,000 Souls. I couldn't finish the book until I figured out, okay, where does that come from? Certainly it's in the oral history, right, of women's conversations and dialogues and interviews that I did. But is there a written origin to the oral tradition? And so part of the difficulty of doing this kolam work was that it was mostly in the oral tradition. There was very few literary references, Tamil or English, to follow. There were a few, and they were like sort of golden spots that I followed, throughout the book. But mainly it was really learning from elder women. So I started this work when I was in my 20s, and the women I spoke with were in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and it was what really unlocked it for me was the idea of the gift of food. That the first ritual act of a household, that a woman householder expresses through making the kolam, is to feed 1,000 souls. Now, why does that matter? Why the 1,000 souls? And why feeding? And why animals? And part of the reason is that a dharmic duty is to feed 1,000 souls, but it doesn't have to be human. It can be animal souls.
Right.
One of the things I found in a 3rd century footnote of a Dharma Shastra text was that when a house is built, when we humans build a home for ourselves, that is one of the greatest sins that we can do in the world. And it's a sin that can never be made up for, no matter all the good dharmic acts we might do. Because the house that we're building, the space was not really ours to build around. It was occupied by other species and other animals who had already built their homes there. So we had to make all these animals homeless in order to create our home. And the idea was that the kolam was a small act of reparations, daily reparations, for all those animals that we kicked out of their homes to build our own home. And when I discovered that near the end of the journey of figuring out the puzzle of this book, it just moved me so deeply, Nandini. I've been an environmentalist since I was 12 years old, and I've studied and taught, many different religious traditions and their relationships to the environment as sacred and the consequences of that knowledge and idea and practice. And I'd never run into something like this before. And I thought, here is something that's 2,300 years old in our own tradition that teaches us, that tells us something that we need as a clue for living in the world today. So the kolam I really see, and I didn't really see this when I started the work on the kolam. I mean, this is a life work, a lifetime work, as you say, and for me as well. But as we are standing at a cliffhanger point for the human civilization, and what we are to do tomorrow and next month and next year in terms of climate and the environment, it really behooves us to really pay attention to that level of sensitivity to the world around us. And I think this is where something like the kolam can help us remember, these teachings of our elders. And I think another aspect of that is also Bhudevi, that is more commonly understood, that, we're doing it to honor and ask for forgiveness to Bhudevi, the goddess of the earth, for all the ill-mannered actions that we're doing on her, both consciously and unconsciously, throughout the day. So that's also what the kolam, in addition to, of course, Lakshmi and bringing in the goddess Lakshmi into the household. And I think part of it for me, when you say, when you ask the second question about, why and how I started the kolam work, for me, it was a wonderful philosopher named Ivan Illich, who's written a lot of books on energy and equity and tools for conviviality, and from the 70s and 80s and 60s. And he was working on a beautiful book called H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness. And he was working on a footnote on women's ritual art. And so he was doing a series of lectures, and my husband and I had gone down there, and we were staying with him. And one morning or one dinner conversation, he said, Vijaya, do you know anything about the kolam? And, I'm so embarrassed, but this is what I said to him. This was in 1984. And I said, oh yeah, the kolam is just something that women do and that my mother does, but there's really nothing much to say about it.
Mm-hmm. It was ritualistic, right? I mean, that's all. Yeah, exactly. Every day you get up, you put a kolam,
Yeah. So that, what you had said about your own perception of the kolam is exactly how I perceived the kolam in 1984. And I said to him, I'll make you a kolam in the morning. But you can ask me any questions you want about it, and I'll try to answer them, And he's one of the most profound philosophers, of probably the 20th century. And so, we talked for 3 hours, from 6 to 9 in the morning. And every single question he had, I was like, I don't know. But something about that conversation really woke me up in a way to seeing the kolam as much larger, as a mirror, as a sign, as a symbol, as a container, really, of so many philosophical ideas. And I also, besides being an environmentalist from the age of 12, I also am a feminist from the age of 12. And so I was always, thinking about what is women's voice in the world and why are we silenced? And I guess for me, the kolam was a remarkable way for me personally to go back, in a sense, back to India. And it gave me the almost like an arrow of time. It gave me a way to return back to India, and to relearn the Tamil language in a more fuller way in order to be able to learn about the kolam, and to study medieval Tamil literature, and to get a PhD in South Asian studies. And so the kolam was like a bridge to another world, really. Mm-hmm. And I just feel so grateful that I took that path. And also another event was the Smithsonian. I was an interpreter and lecturer in 1985. There was a big festival of India. So my mother and I were invited. My mother was invited to do the kolams for that, for 2 weeks. And so from 9 to 5, my mother would be making kolams on a big platform in the heart of Washington, D.C., in the heart of the mall. Wow. At the Smithsonian. And I was 20, just turned 24. And my mother is deaf. So I was partly there to interpret for her, and to translate for her. And I just felt people's interest. And it was the first time that, there was a way in which I kept the Tamil culture in the household, and mm-hmm. outside was American culture, right? And mm-hmm. when I was growing up, and this was the first time that, in a way, they both could come together, in 1985. And then that also opened my eyes, and I got to meet one of the seeds that Illich had actually showed me, the Stella Kramrish, and she was at a conference there, and I got to talk to her. And then she said, well, I only wrote up what I know. If you want to know more, you have to return back to India and ask women. And so that gave me the direction of, to do the research, to do my PhD dissertation on the kolam, and then turn it into a book. It's been a long journey, and with many, many obstacles, and a lot of people, not seeing the importance of it, mm-hmm. initially. People saying, really? You're going to do something on the kolam? Why would you do that? Yeah. So I'm like, I thought the same thing, but that's really not true. I found that there's a lot more layers to it, and the mathematics was amazing to discover. To learn about, and to go and interview amazing mathematicians in India, in Madras, who'd been working on this, and that I got to meet and talk with and interview. And I mean, I just have like 2 boxes of materials on math in the Kolam. So there's actually somebody who, a mathematician who is now working, a woman mathematician who's working on a book on, or a series of articles on math in the Kolam, which I'm really excited about. So my chapter is really a summary of sort of some of the key ideas that I learned from other people's work, But I thought, and that was also a very hard chapter as well. And I'm, that chapter is called Embodied Mathematics. So I'm really interested in how our bodies, I mean, the Kolam is an embodied practice. It's something you wake up in the morning. It's like I almost think of it as a kind of female yoga parallel to the Surya Namaskar,
Yeah.
And when you're watching women bend down and, curling their spine in a sense, and to make the designs. And I actually had the privilege to watch it in the dark, in a village, because I thought, is there something with electricity that might have changed the Kolam? Because it was usually done before sunrise.
Yeah, you think Kolam is more of a visual art, right? You see, you need eyes to draw it out.
Exactly, yeah. But one of the things I discovered was, women would draw it in the light of kerosene lamps in the dark. I mean, I could barely see.
Yeah.
And then I realized, oh, this is actually a kind of dance of the body memory, that the trace left over is the Kolam in some ways. So there's just it's been like an unspooling of knowledge.
You call it ethno-mathematics. I've heard of ethno-music, and how it connects even to students who want to pursue medicine as a career. And when I read this word ethno-mathematics in your book, and I was like very curious to know how that plays a role in Kolam.
Yeah, well, there's a whole culture. I mean, there's a whole subject of study, ethnomathematics, within the field of anthropology that ties together culture and mathematics. And so what I did was there's an amazing woman, Marcia Asher, who's done some very primary work on the Kolam and mathematics, and she really integrated it into the field of ethnomathematics. And it's really how culture shapes our perception of mathematics, and also how the principles of mathematics can have cultural intent and form. And so one of the fascinating things about the Kolam, which is very unusual in terms of ethnomathematics, is that it has actually served for the last, I would say, 50 years, since the 60s, as a space of discovery for Western trained mathematicians. So this is unusual for a folk art to actually serve as a stimulus to discoveries in Western mathematics. So, for example, picture languages and array grammars and matrices. So that's part of what has been stimulated by especially the dot columns, not the kata columns or the other columns, and the figurative columns, but really the dot columns, the pulli columns. So that was really fast, and fractals as well. So you see that when women are making the columns, when they're making these geometric columns, that even though they may not be analyzing them in terms of Western mathematical ideas, they are embodying those Western mathematical ideas in the very drawings themselves.
Exactly. Yeah, during those days, there was no Google, to copy a column design. I used to always wonder, the precision of these women, especially in villages, they had to think, how do I connect the dots without overrunning another squiggly line? Definitely there's a principle of mathematics that existed. This was like centuries ago, when there was no internet or Google to research these things. So they had to actually think and come up with these patterns that is equivalent of a geometric equation or a pattern.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, picture languages. That's what it's in the mathematical theory. That's what it's partly overlapping. The other aspect that I found really fascinating that overlapped between mathematicians and women's discourses and languages around the kolam was the notion of infinity. Mathematicians are interested in like how many designs there are, et cetera, But what women would say to me is that, and this was an amazing conceptualization, I thought, and this was actually in the non-electrified village that a woman told me this, near Tirunelveli, is she said that when we draw the kolam on the front of our thresholds, it is, especially the geometric ones and the pulli kolams, it is as if we're catching a piece of a fold of cloth of infinity. And we're bringing it down in front of our house for just that morning time. And so it just was stunning. I remember just gasping when she said that, because it was so eloquent and so poetic. And how she was imagining it was like as if the geometric kolam, she could see that it was a cloth that went on infinite in the universe.
Wow. That's profound indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, it just, with these kind of things would happen all the time with, the elder women. And so I guess that's what I found so remarkable, was just this opportunity, this chance to go and research and really listen to elder women and what they were saying about the kolam and what it meant to them. This book is really a kind of bridge between those hundreds and hundreds of elder women that I talked with throughout villages and towns, and the wealth of knowledge that they had that wasn't written down anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so it was, a lot of work to travel and, to get the grants and to, mm-hmm. and to get, to be able to go do the research and then do the translation of, thousands and thousands of pages of transcripts in Tamil. I think I had like 5,000 to 10,000 pages, in transcriptions of all the interviews. And so then it took years to translate that and then try to figure out what were the most important aspects of what they had said.
In the pre-COVID era, when I used to ever visit India, I found that it's not so much of an everyday tradition anymore. It's become the kolam as an art itself it is commercialized. I've started seeing more of it on maybe saris or other home decors or stuff, but as a ritualistic art form, it has to be preserved, at least in the urban areas with with globalization, with apartment complexes mushrooming everywhere. Space is also a problem for people to continue with this, and with internet and TV and 10,000 different channels, the whole ritual of getting up in the morning as a first duty. You talked about a duty to our Mother Earth. All that, the finer elements of this art form is, I think, diminishing. I know you've been to all of these very historic temple towns. I'm sure some of it is preserved there, but in the urban areas, I feel like it's almost become extinct.
Yeah. Well, also, or reduced to a plastic stick-on kolam that you put on once and it lasts for a few months. And then maybe the next Diwali or the next festival, you might peel it off and put another plastic stick-on kolam.
Well, the purpose of the environmental duties associated with this is not being followed anymore,
Yeah. No, that's true. And that's the reason I called it Feeding 1,000 Souls, because I really wanted that aspect of the kolam to really come forward, because I think it's something that we really need to know and need to understand. How do we become, really, it's like a kind of a lost training, right? And how do we recover in our contemporary way these sensitivities? Because part of it has to do with time, right? Temporality. When we're in the modern world, which all of us are, we have to be speed queens. We have to multitask. We have to not just do one task, but we have to do several tasks at the same time, or that's what's demanded of us. Parallel processing, right? And so here's a ritual art form that really like builds in meditation, builds in yoga, builds in, and you can do like 30-second kolams. You can do very simple kolams. So it's not that you have to do the elaborate kolams all the time, But I think you're right. And I think that's part of trying to bring forth slowness. We need a slow time movement.
Right. Yeah, I mean, even if you spend 10, 15 minutes drawing a column, it gives you a good mental, physical, emotional, sensual, all kinds of stimulations.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we decide to go to the gym to get a workout or, our ancestors preferred these simple ritualistic acts to unknowingly or unknowingly build it into their everyday life.
Yeah. And I think it was a way of communication. It was a way of telling people. I mean, that's what this book is. Every chapter is like a spoke of a wheel of the underlying meanings of the kolam. So, rituals, thresholds, andal, designs, embodied mathematics, kolam competitions, embedded ecologies, marrying trees and global warming, and then rituals of generosity and feeding 1,000 souls. So I think, that's part of what, is giving the layers, right, of the meaning, of the underlying meaning of the kolam.
Speaking of auspiciousness,
Yes.
I would often wince when I see some kolam designs being disturbed, by somebody stepping on it, or, even visitors to the house. My mom used to always say, don't step on the kolam. So I used to kind of skip and hop around the kolam. And some people would actually take offense if you kind of disturb their kolam. So, so much of it that I would like. And also in movies, at least in the older movies, to depict something inauspicious, or if something bad is going to happen in a future scene, the director would create a scene with a pail of water being poured over the kolam. Do you think this is a true sentiment, or is it just used in movies? I know you've been to so many traditional towns. Do people consider this inauspicious? If I know every day morning you do get up to pour water over the yesterday's kolam and start all over again.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I think, going back to the earlier thread of the conversation of communication, that there was a way in which the kolam was an indicator of the state of being of the household. So if someone had died during the night, this is what women would tell me, is if someone had died in the middle of the night, they wouldn't put a kolam. And immediately the other villagers, when they woke up and they didn't see a kolam in another neighbor's house, they knew that something untoward may have happened. It could be that the woman was in a menstrual state, or there was no woman that was available to do the kolam. But it also could mean that there was a death in the family. So they would immediately find out, and they would immediately start serving that household, bringing food, whatever needed to be done. And so there was no words that had to be spoken by the family that had experienced this tragedy. It was as if the street knew what to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's an incredible, ritual. How does one even call it? Like social communication web of relationship that is embodied within the kolam itself.
Right.
So that,
and this is even before cell phones or telephones, where you could just call somebody if you're in trouble. Right. Yeah,
exactly. But the thing that struck me here is that the family or the household that's experiencing the tragedy doesn't have to tell anyone, this is what's happened and I need this, right? It's as if it's already known that if this has happened, what that household actually needs. I mean, what more represents community than that?
The social cultural dimension you've added to Kolam as well.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Andal previously a little while ago, and we are in the month of Margazhi season. And Andal and the month of Margazhi are synonymous in Tamil Nadu. Andal, for people who are not from Tamil Nadu, is the 9th century Tamil poet and the most ardent devotee of Lord Vishnu. She's like a Meera of South India. At a very, very young age, she composed soul-stirring poetry, popularly known as Tirupavai, and dedicated them to Lord Vishnu. He's also known as Perumal in Tamil. And the Kolam designs are elevated to a really much higher level during this month to create a festive atmosphere and to celebrate the season. And I think you've dedicated a whole chapter on Andal and Kolam. So
Yes.
do you think this art form originated during that time period, like 9th century or even earlier?
Well, that's a great question. I think that we have references even as far back as Vedic times that designs were drawn on the ground to honor the sun, Surya. And so the god Surya. And many women also said that the kolam should be finished before the first rays of the sun hit the front threshold of the household. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of why it had to be done in the dark. And so, of course, the sun is at its lowest point in the month of Margazhi. So in some ways, this month of Margazhi is like the hour before the light comes, it changes, right? So I think both in Nachar Tirumuri, which Andal composed, and the Tirupave, there are references to what we think of as kolams, but they're called mandalas, which is a Sanskrit word for, for ritual designs. But the word kolam, the first reference I could find was actually in the 12th century, in a stone tablet of in Leslie Orr's, one of her footnotes she found that there was actually a statement that a temple had dedicated a certain amount of funds to pay for the rice flour that women would use to make the kolam in that temple. Okay. So somebody had donated, patron had donated some funds for that rice flour in the 12th century. So that's really fascinating. That was like the first reference, but obviously by then it had become more of an everyday practice. And I think with what the Andal chapter for me is really my search for understanding, because many women said to me, you must go to Andal. So I went to Srivilliputtur and I went there a couple of times and hung out with the women there and really asked them about the relationship between Andal and the Kolam. And so that's what I report on in that chapter. And then I also do an analysis of sort of why does Andal, the figure of Andal, connect to the Kolam? Are there metaphorical resonances between the two worlds? And so I talk about, forgiveness, because here's Andal giving a garland to Vishnu that she's already worn and tried out, but that Vishnu loves, even though it's polluted, so-called by her sweat, but it's imbued with her innocence and her desire to give the best to Vishnu, right? Mm-hmm. And so the same thing in the terms of forgiveness, because Vishnu forgives her, doesn't even think of, adores that she's giving her used garland. And the same way, we ask for forgiveness for the earth goddess for using and burdening her throughout the day with the kolam. And so I think that's, and the whole fields of generosity that's activated by both stories. So I talk about that. And I also talk about waking up, like Andal talks about waking up to the divine in the month of Margazhi. Mm-hmm. And I think the kolam is also a kind of generative act of waking up. It's the first act of the day that you do, that you're waking up into yourself for that day through the making of the kolam. Like you might be very sleepy at the beginning of making the kolam, but then as you're making the kolam, you're slowly waking up. And that's very similar to Andal's calling us to wake up to the divine in our lives. I loved doing that chapter. That was really, and I loved Andal even as a child, because like you said, she's so much like Meera, and that she's forgiven for her flaws, by Vishnu. And so I always felt like in some ways as a child, whether I was in India or in America, you don't always learn the full set of rules. So I always felt like if your intention was good, that the divine would forgive you, just as the divine had forgiven Andal.
You mentioned the names Mandana. I mean, Kolam is not only of significance to Tamil Nadu, although it's the art form itself, using the rice flour, is very significant of Tamil Nadu, but it's equally, the similar form of art is popular in other parts of India as well, and it's known by different names.
Yeah.
And I think covering all of these different styles would be like a lifelong project. So you said you focus only on Kolam. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with these other variations of Kolam?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my initial idea when I started was to actually do all the different women's ritual art forms right
Oh,
throughout
wow.
India. And then I slowly realized, no, Kolam was going to take my life itself. I couldn't give, but I did travel to Rajasthan. I traveled to Bengal. I studied the mandanas in Rajasthan a bit, and I studied the alpanas in Bengal. There's Mugus in Andhra Pradesh, Chitta and Orissa, and Rangoli, of course, which we're more familiar with in Karnataka, Gujarat, and Maharashtra, and all over India. And then, beyond India, what really fascinated me also is that there are Navajo sand paintings. Those are made by medicine men, for healing illnesses in the southwestern United States. There in Africa, there is something called the Sona ritual drawings that have very parallel mathematical properties to the dot columns. And so that's in Angola. And then even as fascinating, there's something called Kolams, Caums, or Cauks, Cauks, drawn on thresholds by pre-Christian women to protect the household from harm in Wales and England, which were made even as late as the 1930s. So there's photographs in folklore journals of women Kolams in England, which are very different designs. They're not like the dot columns. They're not like anything design related, but the idea of making it on the threshold is there. And still in the West, there's the old custom of carrying the bride over the threshold. That bride was carried over the threshold that was drawn, that was made sacred initially by the kolam itself. So that was also really fascinating to me, that all throughout the world, not every culture, not every language, not every region, but many places, of course, the Tibetan sand paintings as well, that are done by men. So there are many, many ritual forms that are parallel, which also gives some light on the other ritual traditions as well.
And even in Kerala, they have this art form with flowers, right?
Yes. Yeah. And Spain and Italy also have flowers in certain Catholic festivals that are done in the middle of the village street. I think the other thing that really strikes me about the kolam is that the drawing of the kolam on the thresholds of the houses is a boundary marker between the private household and the general commons, the common land that's owned and common areas. A lot of the knowledge about the commons, about how we take care of that which we hold in common, is also in the oral traditions, just like the kolam knowledge is too. So I think that's a project that I'm working on now, is trying to understand like Porumboka, trying to understand, what are those areas that are beyond the kolam, that are the general shared land, forests, waters, and of course the atmosphere and the air. And how does each language in the world understand the notion of that which we own together?
Well, Dr. Nagarajan, your book, Feeding 1,000 Souls, an exploration of Kolam, is a lifetime's work on this daily ritual of women. It's in a way a celebration of women, particularly in Tamil Nadu. You Absolutely. Have elevated this traditional art form by adding so many dimensions to it. I'm sure every word, every page in this book is dear to you. As we come to the end of this very alluring and insightful discussion on the art of Kolam, can you, I don't know if it's even fair to ask you, read a paragraph or speak about a chapter that holds a special place in your heart?
Sure. I think I wanted to just read something from the very beginning, because I think that kind of gives a little bit of a situation of the kolam itself. And then I'd like to read something from the end. And I realized I didn't mention this, but I really want to, this book is really a celebration of my mother and many, many mothers, in Tamil Nadu, and grandmothers. So let me just begin. This is chapter 1, and it just starts with beginnings. That's the name of the chapter. Even one's own tradition is not one's birthright. It has to be earned, repossessed. The old bards earned it by apprenticing themselves to the masters. One chooses and translates a part of one's past to make it present to oneself and maybe to others. One comes face to face with it, sometimes in faraway places, as I did. And this is a quote from A.K. Ramanujan, who's one of the most incredible translators of ancient classical Tamil poetry and medieval Tamil Bhakti poetry as well. And I urge people to read his work. This is just a beginning of the introduction. Every day in southern India, millions of women wake up before dawn, dreaming of drawing designs filled with their desires for the well-being of themselves, their communities, and the world. These designs, kolams, on the thresholds of homes, temples, and businesses are ephemeral. They're gone a few hours later. Rice dust on the feet of passers-by, blessing both the ritual drawers and those who see them. The kolam is created by Tamil women in Tamil Nadu, the southeastern state in India, and wherever Tamils have migrated, northern India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Singapore, South Africa, England, the United States, and elsewhere. In the Tamil language, the other classical language in India besides Sanskrit, the word kolam means beauty, form, play, disguise, and ritual design. This book is about these kolam designs and what they mean to the kolam who draw them. Women taught me that kolams are made to do something beautiful, to invite, welcome, and host Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, good luck, well-being, and alertness, to banish, unwelcome, and dehost Mudevi, the goddess of poverty, misery, bad luck, sickness, and laziness, to catch the negative effects of the evil eye, jealousy, and envy of those who intend harm, both those you know and strangers, to embody Ganesha, the elephant-headed god, the remover of obstacles, to indicate auspiciousness and well-being, and to prevent suffering and death, to play, with women competing among each other for the best designs, to show one's intimate love for God, to be like the 9th century girl woman saint Andal, who is thought to be one of the first kolam makers, to remember and ask for forgiveness to the earth goddess Bhudevi for our walking and stepping on her, to feed 1,000 souls, and so much more. And then I want to read something from the last chapter, A Ritual of Generosity. And this last chapter is about these 3 clues of the feeding 1,000 souls. There's a lot of stories in here, from the Mahabharata especially. So this story refers to, this particular paragraph refers to the idea of disciplined giving, that giving of food every day to strangers is extremely important as a moral act of Hindus. And so I think that's a very interesting thing, because we think about giving as kind of reciprocal giving, you give a gift and then you expect a gift back, right? This is really giving without any expectation of return. Disciplined giving entails a general duty to give food and hospitality, whether you're rich or poor. The moral value depends on the proportion of what you give compared to what you have, not on the actual amount that you give. The karmic value increases when you give food to an unexpected and unknown guest, and when you give food at the beginning and at the end of the day, as the first and last instance. And I should also mention that in the old days, like even in my mother just turned 85 this year, even in her time period in the 40s, when she was growing up in the 30s and 40s, the kolam was also done at the end of the day. It was done at dusk. And so it was done as a way to actually say goodbye to Goddess Lakshmi, for serving us to be alert in our body, and to actually welcome Mudevi into our bodies, to give rest, to invite rest into our bodies and into our homes, which again, I think is very important that we've also forgotten to do.
Yeah.
The kolam creatively addresses these facets of disciplined giving by symbolizing and fulfilling the moral duty of giving away food. It also symbolizes and fulfills the act of giving food to an unexpected stranger. The act of, quote unquote, feeding 1,000 souls is a disciplined way to give, and the kolam is a personification of this very discipline.
That's beautiful. I've learned so much about Kolam, and your book is truly, it is definitely will fill the souls of the readers. I'm positive about it. Thank you so much for taking the time to provide insight into Kolam and what it embodies, and beyond just connecting the dots. I think I saw some of the photographs that accompanies the pages of your book, and each of those photographs, so beautiful and tells their own story about women who create this ritualistic art. I will for sure proudly display this book on my coffee table. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you today, Dr. Nagarajan.
Yes, and same here as well, Nandini, and good luck to all the good work you're doing.
Thank you so much. I hope you all enjoyed how Professor Nagarajan eloquently talked about the Kolam, and I'm sure so many of you are pleasantly surprised that there's so much more to this art form than what meets the eye. Her book, Feeding 1,000 Souls, Women, Ritual and Ecology in India, an exploration of the Kolam, is available on Amazon and other booksellers. You will surely enjoy every page of this artful history guide. She has done a TEDx talk on Kolam as well. Check it out on YouTube. After listening to Dr. Nagarajan speak about Kolam and its significance, I was wondering, how do we preserve and pass on this age-old art form to our kids and future generations? I came across a children's book on Kolam. The author, Anuradha Ananth, creates a simple yet touching storyline using Kolam as a bond between a grandmother and her grandchild. The very first page brought a smile to my face. There's a beautiful illustration of a bird with eager eyes looking at a bowl of rice flour that is being used to draw the Kolam. Anuradha studied literature, journalism and communications in India and has worked in television and theater for 15 years. She's currently based in Potsdam in Germany, where she lives with her journalist husband and 3-year-old son. As a full-time mom, she continues to pursue her passion for writing children's books. Her adorable son is now an inspiration. Just like Professor Nagarajan eloquently told us about the karmic or socio-cultural duty we have as humans in terms of feeding others, other souls, and that includes not just humans, it includes animals, insects, and birds. Such a beautiful traditional art with a secret, almost hidden ritual, caring for another living being, isn't it? Now that you've heard so much about Kolam, what is the first thought that comes to your mind when you think about this art form? For me, it feels like a Kolam design feels like a warm welcome. Think about it while we hear Anuradha's thoughts on it.
Right now, it would be a feeling of deep nostalgia and painful homesickness because I live away from India. I live in a city called Potsdam in Germany. Mm-hmm. And due to the pandemic, I've been cut off from travel. I haven't been home in two years. So when I look at a Kolam now, I must say I get very emotional and very, very homesick. But in an overall sense, what a Kolam evokes in me is a sense of profound joy and a profound sense of connectedness and rootedness to my culture. It's just such a happy illustration of there's just so much significance in a Kolam, and I think it's a marrying of mathematics and art. So, my inspiration was the Mylapore Arts Festival in Madras. So every January in Margazhi, there is an arts festival in Mylapore, which is really the soul of Chennai, near the Kapalishwara temple. Mm-hmm. And on 2 days, they have Kolam competitions. So they have about more than 100 people, I think, men and women, old and young and kids and everything participating. They just draw Kolams on the street, on the main street. And if you look at it from an aerial perspective, it is just absolutely stunning. In fact, you can see it on their website, mylapurfestival.com. You could see pictures of this, of the way they do this Kolam competition. So I used to be a TV journalist when I lived in India, and I would cover, various happenings in the city. And for many years, I covered the Mylapore Festival, and I thought, what a wonderful thing. And I looked for books, children's books on Kolams, and I didn't find anything. So I thought, why don't I write one? And I wrote it in 10 minutes. Okay, I wanted it to be a pictorial book, not a text-heavy book. So it was just one line of text for each page.
Yeah.
And then after I wrote it, I thought, oh my God, no one's going to be interested, it's so childish. Mm. And then I happened to be talking about it to a friend of mine who was working for Tulika Publishers. And she said, why don't you show it to me? And I showed it to her, and she said, this is just perfect for little children, an introduction to this art form. So she took the book, and it took my text, and they found my illustrator, Shailaja. Mm-hmm. So Shailaja did the illustrations, and I saw the final product, and it just made me so happy. So that was my inspiration, the Mylapore Kolam competition.
When you hear the word coconut, the first thing that comes to most of our minds is an Indian cuisine or a sweet dish, right? Anuradha has taken this everyday staple in Indian kitchens to weave a story on another little-known traditional art, the art of making coconut dolls. This book is titled A Nutty Story, the art of making dolls from coconuts.
So that idea came again from both my grandmothers, who were very, very creative. They used to make dolls from the hard coconut shell, but also the kernel inside once it's dried. In Tamil, we call it kopprai, or in Kannada, kobri.
Kopprai, yeah.
So they would take the whole thing and carve, designs on them, or even sometimes stick little sequins and buttons and colorful ribbons and make dolls out of them, dolls and animals. And these would be kept as part of a wedding trousseau, or, on the tambulam plate.
Wow.
In front of the gods on festival days. And sadly, this was an indication of how creative the women were in that household, So when you kept it as part of the wedding trousseau, it was like an act of impressing the other side, okay? Mm-hmm. But, we can't do it. Sadly, even I can't do it. It's a dying art form. So I thought I wanted to write about this, but I lost both my grandmothers a while ago, and I dedicated this book to them, and I wrote it in their memory.
I am hopeful that more writers like Anuradha Anant will continue to bring back some of these lost and forgotten art forms and help bridge the cultural gap for our future generations. Putting together this episode on Kolam was truly been like a therapeutic meandering of the mind. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Putting together this episode on Kolam was truly been like a therapeutic meandering of the mind. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. But many people around the world may be struggling to cope during this time of the year. For those of you who are homesick for family and friends, mentally and physically drained, grieving a loss of a loved one this year, trying to hold it all together, worried about what next year holds, or simply trying to feel the magic of this festive season, I send you much love. Merry Christmas, and have a happy new year. Talk to you all soon in the new year with another episode of the Stories Between the Lines podcast.